Friday the 13th, specifically Friday, March 13th, 2020, is the day the seriousness of this COVID-19 thing really started to sink in for me. My trip to Israel-Palestine had been just 2 months earlier, and I think now with amazement of how I ate falafel from a street vendor who had picked it up with his bare hands before putting it in the bag, and the number of shared meals I ate on that trip. Baskets of pita that everyone at the table grabbed from, and the plates of hummus, tabbouleh, baba ganoush, and other salads that we all dipped our pita into. And I think about the big rings of sesame-crusted bread. One of us would buy a ring and then pass it around for everyone on the bus to tear off a chunk. 1 month earlier had been my Valentine's cabaret at the church. Fellowship Hall was packed with people, and everyone celebrated, shook hands, and hugged one another without concern. 11 days earlier, on Monday, March 2nd, I attended a meeting of local clergy where Medicare expansion was discussed. I met Governor Laura Kelly and shook her hand. When my friend Paul refused a handshake and instead offered her an elbow bump, I joked with him about being paranoid. The following day, Tuesday, March 3rd, Francie, Katie, and I went to see the musical Waitress at Century 2, and I thought nothing of sitting shoulder to shoulder with 2,000 other people for over 2 hours. Sunday, March 8th, we had a pancake feed fundraiser for the youth group after church. Wednesday, March 11th, I had a lunch board meeting for Music Theater for Young People, and I thought she was being a bit extreme when the executive director asked us to consider options in case the upcoming show was not able to be performed because of the virus. Although by this time I did think that we would need to take extra precautions in rehearsal and ask the kids to wash their hands when they came in and stay home if they were at all sick, I couldn't quite imagine that the show would be canceled. That same evening, a number of Plymouth members attended the Four Horsemen of Kansas event at St. James Episcopal Church. A couple of Plymouth members called to say they would not be in attendance because of the virus, and the priest at St. James was wearing a mask that evening. Thursday, March 12th, Chris Shaw had his high school choir concert at the church, and I welcomed a full sanctuary of the students' family and friends to Plymouth before heading upstairs to what would be our final Godspell rehearsal. The morning of Friday, March 13th, it finally sunk in. I would finally come to a realization that Godspell must be postponed indefinitely, and that afternoon Dawn would come into my office to ask my opinion on whether or not I thought we should cancel Sunday's worship service. As you know, we did cancel worship that week, and beginning Sunday, March 22nd, we went to an online-only worship format. I thought at the time we might be doing this online thing for about 8 weeks. We've been doing it for 10 weeks now with no end in sight. Sunday, March 15th, with the worship service canceled and nothing else to do, I felt a strong desire to bake some bread. I found the process of mixing and kneading and allowing it to rise and then punching the dough back down and shaping it into loaves and baking it. I found that it calmed my worried mind, and it gave me a sense of accomplishment. It was so therapeutic that those first couple of weeks of sheltering in place, bread baking became an almost daily activity for me. I went to Sam's and bought a 25-pound bag of flour and tried to purchase one of their big bags of yeast, but they were sold out. I found a few small packages at the Dillons in Newton. The woman at the checkout was surprised they had any left on the shelves at all, as she said it was selling like hotcakes. I have not been able to find yeast anywhere in town since. As I'm sure you know by now, from seeing countless pictures of homemade bread on people's social media pages, I was not the only one who felt the call to bake bread during this pandemic. With my daily bread baking and not much yeast on hand, I decided to make a sourdough starter so I wouldn't need to use store-bought yeast. But interestingly enough, all of the bread recipes I had that used a sourdough starter also required additional yeast to be added. This made no sense to me, as I thought the whole purpose of having the starter was so you wouldn't need yeast. I searched online and found a recipe that used just the starter and realized why most recipes added the extra yeast. Without the added yeast, the bread went from taking 2 to 3 hours to complete to taking a full 24 hours to complete. Who had that kind of time? Well, I guess I did now that I was working from home. Well, what did it matter if I had to let the dough rise for 1 hour or 12 hours? I certainly didn't have anywhere I needed to be. I decided I might as well give it a try, and it turned out to be my favorite bread of all that I've made. This talk of bread baking reminds me of one of the very first classes I took in seminary in the fall of 2008, Intro to New Testament. The first assignment for that class was a word study. We were told to pick one word from one of the 4 Gospels, research it, and write a 5-page paper about it. I chose the word leaven from the parable of the leaven in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Little did I know when I picked that word that my professor for the class, Brandon Scott, had spent his life's work studying and writing about the parables, particularly the parable of the mustard seed and of the leaven. Fortunately, I came to this realization quickly, otherwise my paper may have focused on the traditional belief of scholars that the word leaven is used as a metaphor for hidden growth. Just as the entire batch of dough is transformed by a small amount of leaven, so will the whole world be transformed through Jesus' ministry. It can also be compared to like a ripple effect. When you drop a pebble in the water, one small pebble sends out waves in all directions. Yeah, if I'd have taken that road, Brandon most likely would have failed me. But fortunately, I got my hands on a copy of his book, Reimagine the World, An Introduction to the Parables of Jesus, and I was introduced to a whole new way of understanding the parable of the leaven. Many versions of the Bible translate the word not as leaven, but as yeast. And the problem with this translation is that we imagine a clean little packet of Fleshman's purchased at the store instead of a piece of bread left in a dank, dark place to get moldy. Yes, apparently moldy old bread was used to make a new batch of bread rise. It worked off fermentation the same way as my sourdough starter. Probably the most well-known appearance of the word leaven in the Hebrew Bible is its appearance during the institution of the Passover. Here the Israelites are instructed to remove leaven from your houses. God demands that they begin their new year by eating unleavened bread for 7 days. Since the leaven used was a piece of fermented dough from the prior batch, the Israelites would be starting anew by not using anything from last year's crops. Eating unleavened bread during the Passover served to remind the Israelites of the Exodus, and also reminded them of their service to God. Symbolically, leaven and fermentation represented corruption. The small amount of fermented dough made its way through and corrupted the entire batch. Leaven, as well as honey, was considered unsuitable for burnt offerings, most likely because the fermentation process would have been looked on as a form of decay. Just as a dead corpse will swell while decaying, so a batch of dough swells with the addition of leaven. You may have observed a dead raccoon or a possum by the side of the road. It's all swelled up, pretty gross. Leviticus makes it very clear that leaven is not to be used as an offering to God. The idea of leaven being a symbol of corruption is present in the New Testament writings, as well as other Greek and Roman traditions. Persius, a Roman satirist, used the word fermentum when referencing moral corruption. In the New Testament, leaven is used as a symbol of moral and political corruption. Examples appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus said to them, "Look, take care and guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." The Apostle Paul uses leaven in a negative way when he writes to the people of Corinth, telling them to expel a certain man from their community, as he has been living with his stepmother, a relationship forbidden by Jewish law. Paul says, "Your boasting is not a good thing. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast so that you may be a new batch as you really are unleavened. Therefore let us celebrate the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." With all the negative references to leaven in the Bible, including hypocrisy, corruption, malice, and evil, it's strange that in regards to the parable of the leaven, many scholars believe that the word is used as a metaphor for hidden growth. Brandon Scott argues that we cannot ignore that in every other instance, leaven is a sign of corruption and unworthy of God, and unleavened is a metaphor for the sacred and holy. First century audiences would have at the very least been thrown off guard by the kingdom of God being compared to leaven that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all was leavened. And it may have even thrown them into a panic. How can the kingdom of God be corrupt? How is this good news? Add to that it's a woman, Who is the central figure of the story? Women during the Roman Empire were not considered equal to men. It was a patriarchal society after all. So a lowly woman is making the bread. And this woman conceals the leaven, the corruption in the dough. Scott points out that the more negative Greek word crypto is used for the hiding rather than the more neutral word calypto. So it sounds like she's hiding something. Finally, at the end of the story, the batch is leavened. So again, how is this good news? Well, consider what had gone on in Rome in recent history. Augustus had brought peace to Rome, but only by destroying the Republic and wielding power through war and domination, which meant there was only peace if you were Roman. Otherwise, there was oppression. The Greek word in the parable often translated as kingdom is basilia. To what shall I compare the basilia of God, the kingdom of God? The problem with the word kingdom, according to Scott, is that to 21st century American ears it sounds old-fashioned and otherworldly. It is the stuff fairy tales are made of. First century listeners would have heard this word and automatically thought of the Roman Empire. So a better translation would be, to what shall I compare the empire of God? Jesus' audience would hear empire of God as being in opposition to the empire of Rome. So this parable would have been good news to a great many people in the ancient world. It was good news for women. It was good news for the poor. It was good news for anyone oppressed by the Roman Empire, because it meant all these people on the margins were a part of the empire of God. This is one of my favorite parables, and I thought I had it all figured out when I wrote that first paper back in 2008. But the most amazing thing about parables is that there is no set meaning to them. They can mean different things to different people at different times, depending on the lens that you are reading them through. And a number of weeks ago, while I was in the midst of my COVID sourdough starter bread baking, I had more bread than my family could eat, and so I delivered 3 of the loaves to some church members. And while I was driving from house to house in my car, I thought of this parable and I sensed a new meaning to it that I couldn't quite wrap my mind around. So I decided to try an experiment today to see if I could get a better understanding of what I was feeling. We are in my kitchen because I would like to act out, to the best of my ability, the parable of the leaven. To what shall I compare the empire of God? It is like leaven. For my leaven, I will use my sourdough starter that a woman took and concealed in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. Okay, slight problem. 3 measures of flour is not a unit of measurement that we are used to hearing. I looked it up and it's about 50 pounds. 50 pounds of flour. I told you Sam sells 25-pound bags of flour, so I tried to go there and buy 2 bags so I could show you what 50 pounds of flour looks like. But because of everyone buying up all the flour and yeast for their home baking projects, Sam's is limiting flour purchases to 1 25-pound bag per person, which really is fine because the biggest bowl that I could find is this one from the mixer at church. And there's no way that 25 pounds of flour with all the other stuff will fit in here, let alone 50 pounds, which makes me wonder what this peasant woman was doing making so much bread. It's assumed she was a peasant woman because a woman in the city would have purchased bread from the market. Now, what on earth was she doing making bread with 50 pounds of flour? That would have been enough bread for 150 people. And what would she mix that much flour in? Well, not only do I have no way of mixing 50 pounds of flour at one time, I don't have near enough sourdough starter for that much flour, even though I've continued to add to my original starter, and it's now triple the size of what it started out at. Now, my original recipe calls for 1 cup of starter per 5 cups of flour. So I think I have enough starter for 30 cups of flour, which, if I did the math correctly, is more like 8 pounds of flour. Okay, so this isn't going to be much of a reenactment of the parable after all, but it has given me a better understanding of just how ridiculous it would have sounded to Jesus' audience. So let's make some bread. To start with, I have my flour measured out already. I need 6 cups of starter. 2. added to my flour and my starter, I need 9 cups of warm water. And then this bowl is pretty full, and I'm still going to have more flour to add later. And then this all gets mixed together, and it sits for 16 hours, so I guess I'll see you tomorrow. Well, here we are again. It's been about 16 hours, so let's take a look at how our dough is doing. Oh yeah, it's all nice and bubbly, and that leavening agent is starting to work. So next we're going to take 6 tablespoons of sugar, 4.5 tablespoons of salt, and as well as the remaining 12 cups of flour. And it's all in here, and then we're going to mix it until we have a smooth, firm dough. Did you know that taking into consideration in all of its various forms, bread is the most widely consumed food in the world? Until recently, the established archaeological belief was that humans first began baking bread around 10,000 years ago at a pivotal time in our evolution. This was the period of time when humans began giving up their nomadic way of life and started settling in one place and farming and growing grains. Those grains were then ground into flour and used to bake bread. However, according to a 2018 piece on NPR, an archaeologist working on an excavation site in Jordan discovered tiny black particles scattered around an ancient fireplace. Turns out they were breadcrumbs left over from a hunter-gatherer tribe that lived in the area 14,000 years ago, which means that our ancestors were bakers first and farmers second. The researchers who made this discovery speculated that instead of domesticating cereals first, the bread-making culture could have been something that actually fueled the domestication of cereal. Bread baking is labor intensive, and if humans learned to bake before settling down to farm, it's likely they saved baking bread for special occasions only. Could have been the humans' desire to indulge in eating bread more often that prompted them to shift to farming. According to an article on History.com, bread baking began more like 30,000 years ago. Prehistoric humans first made gruel from water and grains, which they eventually began cooking on stones over a fire. A 2010 study found traces of starch from the roots of cattails and ferns in prehistoric mortar and pestle-like rocks. At first, all bread was flatbread. We see the relatives of early flatbread in things like Middle Eastern pita, Indian naan, Central American tortillas, showing that bread really did come from all corners of the world. Leavened bread was first discovered by the Egyptians. It was most likely an accident. Yeast floats around naturally in the air looking for a place to find a home. Some yeast probably found its way into a bowl of some Egyptian's flour and water mixture that had been allowed to sit out. The yeast would have begun to eat the sugars present in the grain, causing the excretion of CO2 and producing bubbles that would have resulted in bread that was not flat, but raised. The leavened bread was desirable and eventually led to commercial yeast production. So, looks like I need to add a little more flour. It's pretty sticky. And I'm gonna knead this until it's soft and smooth, and it's gonna then rise for about 5 hours. So I'll see you back here in about 5 hours. Okay, the mixing of the dough did not go exactly as I expected. I had to add quite a bit of flour to get it to the right consistency. We might be a bit closer to 9 pounds of flour now. Still, our woman from the parable was dealing with more than 5 times that. You saw what a time I had dealing with the amount I was working with. Imagine if I had 50 pounds of flour. It's only been about 4 hours, but our dough, as you can see, is ready to go. And the next step is my favorite, punching the dough down. It's a good way to take out your frustrations. We will then divide it into 24 loaves, and you guessed it, cover and let it sit. This time for about 2 to 4 hours. Oh man. And it's still sticky. I may need to add more flour. See you in 2 to 4 hours. Okay, so the final step was the baking, and first I had to brush the tops with water and then cut slits in the bread. I set the oven to 425 degrees and baked them for about 25 minutes. Imagine, if you will, our peasant woman from the parable of the leaven with her 50 pounds of flour compared to our 8 or 9 pounds of flour. and what type of oven she would have been working with and the conditions she was in. If I think this was a lot of work, it was nothing compared to what she did. And here we are with the finished product, 24 loaves of sourdough bread. Now there's no way my family will be able to eat all this, so I guess I'll drive around town and find some people to share it with. Before this experiment, I knew that the empire of God was good news for the marginalized and oppressed. What I have learned from this experiment is that the empire of God is bigger than you can fit in your biggest mixing bowl. The empire of God takes time and therefore patience. It cannot be rushed, but it may also surprise you and not take as long as you expected. The empire of God can be found in the kitchen. It can be found in the work a woman does. It is here and now, and at the same time, something we are always working toward. The empire of God is sometimes hidden. The empire of God is found in our daily bread. And when we have more than our daily bread, the empire of God asks us to share what we have with others.